This video is sponsored by Brush Galaxy. Okay, welcome to another iPad painting tutorial. On today's tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to paint a wave wash. This is washing up onto the beach, so we're going to do some sand, some water, and some water effects. Now, I'm using the app Procreate on the iPad Pro, but it will work on any of the newer iPads and even quite a lot of the old ones. I'm also using the Apple Pencil, and I've just opened an A4 default canvas within the app Procreate. In terms of the colors, I've already pre-selected some colors within the app. If you look down in this video description, you'll see there are some hexadecimal codes within colors. You can type them here one at a time. The color will appear up here and you can tap them here and piece together the palette that way. Or alongside that in the description, there is a link to my Patreon page and you can download it there as a file for free. Alongside the color link, there is also a link for my Instagram and my Facebook group. So if you do follow along with this tutorial and you're pleased with your results, then make sure to share them with me there and also other people as part of that community. In terms of the brushes I'm going to be using predominantly airbrushing. I do tend to use the same kinds of brushes within my tutorials. Most of this I'm going to be using the soft brush within airbrushing and the medium brush also within airbrushing. With all that being said, the first thing we're going to do is go to our first color, which is the top left. We're going to drag it from that color circle into the center of our canvas. It will flood and fill the entire canvas really easily. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the adjustments. We're going to go to the noise option. We want to affect the entire layer. I've not changed any of the other settings. We're just going to slide it across until it gets to about 15%. And if I zoom in, you'll see that it has created noise, pixelation, which actually helps give the effect of a sandy beach. So if we want to create just a little bit more interest on this background sand, then we can go to our brushes. The medium brush is fine. I'm just going to put it to about 4% size and really low on the opacity, so about 5% opacity. And I'm just going to start creating subtle changes, and you won't really notice it very dramatically, but it just breaks it up. And I'm just creating some stripes. I might even try some bigger, so 10%. I'm just creating breaks, the slight sense that there's subtle ripples perhaps in that sand. You're hardly going to notice it on camera and I'm hardly seeing it in front of me, but it does just stop it looking quite as flat and quite as dead. And the whole top section we're going to cover up with water effect anyway, but just for this bottom section, just create the sense that there is some slight movement and shifts, slight undulations rather in the sand. But you don't want to go too extreme with it. If it looks like big stripes, then it's actually going to distract away and not be beneficial. So it's really subtle. Okay, we're going to create another layer. On this layer, we're going to go back to our colors. We're going to go for this second color along now. We're already using it a little bit before, but we're going to make it a more impactful part of this section. So we're going to put it at around 10% size or thereabouts, put it up to about 80% opacity, and I'm just going to paint through this scene some kind of ripple like this. Now I might just go over it a couple of times, something like that. Now I'm going to go back to my colors. I'm going to use the third color in now, and I'm just going to do the same thing up here, but just above it. So we're still on the same layer, and I can color this in all to the top of that layer. I'll just zoom in a little bit more. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create another layer. I'm going to go to the slightly darker color, and I'm just going to introduce that at the top and just maybe dip it a little bit to almost run alongside the shape that we've already created. And then I'm going to go to my adjustments. I'm going to go to my Gaussian blur. I want to affect that whole layer, and I'm just going to blur it in slightly to about 30%. I'm going to create another layer, go back to my colors, and I'm going to go to the last color on the top row, still on the medium brush, but I'm going to turn it down to about 5% size. We'll have it on the 80% opacity. And we're just going to run a line just where the two colors meet between the sand color and that water, just like this. And because it's on a separate layer, we can take that one element and we can blur it in just to soften the transitions between those two colors. We'll go to the Gaussian blur, affect the whole layer, and we'll blur it in, not too far because then you start to see the original colors underneath. So just far enough that it helps transition between the two, but not too far that you start to see the original layers. So something around the 12% looks about right to me. Now I think I want to concentrate that effect just a little bit more centrally, so I'm going to take my eraser and check what the setting of the eraser is. So it's on soft brush, that's great. We'll put it up to about 5% size eraser and keep quite low, about 15% on the eraser, and just remove it, subdue it slightly on these edges. I want it to be more impactful in this area. Now those top layers, I'm just going to merge them together to make one layer. So that now is all going to be on layer 2. And the advantage of that is that we can then use the transform tool, and if we want to extend it a little bit further into our scene or expand it or do anything with it, then we can do it as one complete layer really easily. So I am going to do that now. I'm going to go to the freeform. I'm just going to drag it a little bit further down into my scene. Something like this. I'm going to create another layer. Go to my colours, and I'm going to go to this first white colour. I'm going to use the medium brush again. I'm going to put the size of the brush at about 3% and the opacity at 80%. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. And along this edge now, where we have a darker sand colour and a lighter sand colour, I'm going to use that as my guide to start adding the broken water. So where the water becomes churned up and becomes a white froth and foam, this is what we're doing now. So I'm pressing lightly for some areas, and that way we'll get a little bit less than a white colour. And then if I want to go over it just here and there, then I can increase the amount of white that we need. And I'm pretty much going to follow that most of the way along. I say most of the way because actually it can detach from that line at times. Because although that might be the edge of the water, the actual frothy foam doesn't need to go all the way to the edge of the water. It is a floating element on top of the actual water. So sometimes that froth is going to be at the front, and sometimes it's just a little bit stepped back from the leading edge of the water. So we're creating quite a broken shape and texture as we go around. But then you have it fragmenting as well. So sometimes I'm tapping, allowing it to loosen and break. And sometimes perhaps here we'll add almost like it's got a leg that branches off. And then other points that as it goes further up, maybe you'll see it fragment further. Maybe we've got another section here, for example, where we have lots of fragmented pieces. You can see it's all stemmed or have been connected there at some point somehow. But you can see that it has broken up. And you don't want it to just go in a straight line. You can have it bending left and right or arcing. Water never keeps still, and it's not going to be uniform. It's going to change direction. It's going to be chaotic. So you're going to have some trends of the water to take certain shapes, but it is going to be slightly chaotic. Now you can switch between the two colours. So we've got the white and we've got a very light colour here in addition. So in addition to that white, perhaps we could use some of this colour as well. It might be a good idea, in fact, to use more of this slightly light blue. So if I go to the colour list, you can see where it's located. So it is a green blue, but it is a very pastel version of that. And by contrast to the rest of the colours that we've got there, it's going to appear a lot lighter. But we then have the white in reserve to really bring out sharp contrast when we need it. I'm also going to turn the brush size down to 2%, still at 80% opacity, and perhaps I can just create some smaller broken textures now with this blue colour. Subdue some of the white that we've already put on there. Again, this can be a churned up element, so some edges of it may pick up the light and be a little whiter, but other bits of it may be more of that blue. Now, I wouldn't take the blue over into this section. You can see it's going to contrast badly. It's going to be too visible, but anywhere we're over in this greeny blue area, then actually the blue is working pretty well for that section. Now, there isn't a specific set of shapes that are going to work better than others, but there is a tendency to take certain forms like we've just discussed, where it seems to be loosely connected but fragmenting off. So you're going to just have to experiment to find the right balance between something that seems like it has a connection and then also the element of disruption and chaos. Now once I get over to here, like I was saying, I might switch over to the white and press lightly with the white where we get that transition. Perhaps it's important to start making decisions about where the light is coming from. Now I'm imagining the light coming from this section, so it's coming down at that angle. So perhaps the light is just hitting the edge on this side for the lightest bits. So alternate between the two. Sometimes it's okay to have big sections where you don't have necessarily a lot of disruption and that foam appearing. Doesn't have to be absolutely jammed full. I think breaks in texture mean that the texture is more interesting when it does appear. If you just absolutely cram it full, sometimes it loses the impact. So allow it to be broken, allow it to be a varied amount. Perhaps allow some shapes to be a little bit bigger and all connected. Doesn't have to be entirely fragmented in some sections. And then perhaps in other areas you're going to get real concentrations of it, so you get a real dense area of this type of texture as well. So some areas lots of big gaps, and then other areas not really any gaps at all, or much denser, more compacted fragments. Again, go back to the white when necessary, especially as it starts to encroach on this area. The blue starts to look a little strange, so we need to go back to the white. But again, we're at 80% opacity, so it's quite strong, so press lightly when we get into this area. Now, if you want to experiment with more textures, notice I'm only using the basic brushes within Procreate. You might want to head over to Brush Galaxy, the sponsor of this video. It's a brilliant brush subscription website service with over 20,000 premium Procreate brushes. You can save over 90% of the cost by subscribing and paying monthly, and it's got tons of different categories such as portrait, pattern, texture, nature, and loads more. If you subscribe today, you get the first 7 days free. You can unlock up to 12 brush packs for free, worth over $300. The links are in the comments and also the video description. So we're just carrying on with these fragmented shapes using the medium brush. We're still at the 2% size and the 80% opacity. Allowing some areas to clump together to make these bigger shapes, and I'm actually allowing it to be a lot denser in this area than I am in other areas. Okay, I'm going to return to that leading edge, start adding more of that froth in as well, doing circular motions. Fragmenting from that edge, just some points where it breaks up just from the edge. I may come back to that layer, add a little more, but I'm going to create another layer. So we've got layer 4, but it goes underneath layer 3. I'm going to go back to my colours. And I've got two colours now. At the end, we've got a grey that we will go back to, but we've got beyond that 2 colours. We've got a dark, rich colour, and we've got a light colour. I'm going to go to my dark, rich colour first. And going back to my settings, I'm going to put the brush size still at 2% size, but I'm going to reduce it massively down to about 15%. And I'm just going to and I'm actually using quite a light touch with this. I'm going to create a mottle texture behind. So I'm kind of moving with the shapes. So I'm not going to ignore the things I've already done. I'm kind of moving along with it somewhat, but I'm just creating a series of blobs and texture, keep it really quite random. And I'm just using that general movement to create noise underneath the surface. So it's almost like a combination between a scribble and a tap. So I'm scribbling, I'm going round and scribbling as I go, but I'm also allowing the pencil to lift off the surface. So it's a broken scribble. And it's a subtle effect, but it stops it looking quite so flat underneath. And I'm going to use a lighter colour in addition to this. And the combination of that plus the shadows that we're going to use really helps. And if we get an area perhaps where you imagine the water circulating around, we can allow almost this shape to bounce in and around circular areas like this. Not completely round, but maybe it's got a section like that. Again, I'm pressing lightly. Try not to encroach too much on the sand there, so I feel I've gone too far in that area. I'll just erase it back a little bit. Perhaps we need to switch to the darker sand colour when we get to the sand area. Or we could even use the dark grey, perhaps. Again, we're using it lightly. So we're going to use that dark colour and we've got the lighter colour at the end. Now, again, try not to go too much over the shapes you've already done, but again, following the trends, the direction that you've already done. So we're still on the 2% size and the 15% opacity, not changed those things. We're just creating the effect that perhaps the water is distorting, is bouncing light around, is actually creating light ripples on the surface of the sand that's under the water. The more of this we do, the more convincing that effect will be. So it's a combination of the dark and the light. Go back to my dark colour again. More of this over here. And the lights colour. And we're starting to build up an effect. I'm going to go back to the layer with the top layer, in fact, with the froth on, and I'm going to go and add some more of that effect. So between the white and the blue, I think I need more of that white in places. So we do need to turn that opacity back up to 80%, otherwise it just won't be seen. It is important we get all the white foam and breaks and froth before we move on to the next effect, because creating the shadow is going to use a duplication of this texture. So unless we've got it all in place, it's just not going to work properly later on. So spend the time getting this section right before you move on. Not so much in this edge, but certainly anywhere in the blue area. You need to make sure you've got all your little points of white break. Okay, so I'm going to leave the broken white texture like that for this stage, and I'm going to duplicate that layer. Now I'm going to go to the layer that is immediately underneath. I'm going to go to my adjustments. I'm going to go to the hue and saturation. I want to affect that entire layer, and I'm going to turn the brightness completely down on it. I'm going to go to my layer properties, click on the N, turn the opacity down to about 30%, go to my transform tool, which is over here, this arrow, and I'm going to move the layer independently underneath it. Now I'm going to do this twice because some areas are going to be in deeper water, and like I was partly explaining before, there's going to be a bigger separation between the objects and the shadows when we're in deeper water. So I'm going to concentrate on the top section to begin with. So I'm allowing a bigger gap, and think about where the light was coming from too. So it's coming from this side. So it's going to be underneath certainly, but it's going to be offset. So like this. So there'll be some cases perhaps where the shadow and the thing that's causing the shadow, there's a gap between them. And I feel that something like this works. Having said that, it's not going to be completely appropriate for every single section. So I'm going to, for this layer, start to remove some elements. So I'm going to go to the eraser, it's on soft brush, I'm going to put it at around 5% size and quite strong at 50% opacity. So I'm just going to remove the shadow from the bits that I think are going to be shallower, and obviously doesn't need a big separation between the shadow and the thing that's causing the shadow. So I want to remove it from the shallow water areas. Anywhere that's on the sand, for example, is going to be more shallow, so it's not going to have a big separation. Like this little section here, perhaps is not going to have a big separation, and just take it a step backwards. Okay, but we do want a shadow there, so we're going to have to put something back in place for that section. Before I do that, however, I'm just going to reduce the impact of that just a little bit more. At 30% is quite powerful, so I'm going to reduce it to about 25%. I think that's going to be just a little bit better. So I'm going to go back to my layer 3 again. That was the layer that had the white froth on. I'm going to duplicate it again, put it underneath layer 3. Again, I'm going to go to my hue, saturation and brightness, affect that entire layer and turn the brightness down. I'm going to go to my transform tool again, and I'm just going to nudge it slightly in the same direction that I did before. So down and to the right. So just a little bit in this example, as you can see. And that may even be a little bit too much. So just a hint in that direction, like that. And again, we can turn the opacity down. So we had it at 25, so let's do the same again. But the only bit we really wanted to add actually was the bit that was on the sand and the shallows. So we've got enough from the previous layer in the top section. So similar to what I did before, we're on the eraser, 5% size, 50% opacity, but this time we're removing it from that top section where we'd created a shadow already on a previous layer. In fact, let's whack that up to 100% opacity. Let's just get rid of the impact of this new layer because we don't want it confusing what we've already done on that old layer. So now we've got a combination of large separation between the object and its shadow, and then a much smaller separation between the object and the shadow in the shallow areas. Now, obviously there is something of an error. At the top of that layer here, we can see a straight line that's up there, and I'll just zoom in, and that's a problem. So we can go to the smudge tool, make sure we're on the right layer of that shadow, which is that layer 3, and we can just smudge it in, soften the impact of that, just so it's not so obvious. Now I feel that's starting to create the sense that there's some depth. I think that's working quite well. So let's put our two shadow layers together. So they're both called layer 3, the same as the layer we duplicated, but we're just going to merge them together. And that way we can see the impact of with and without the shadow. I'm going to go to our top layer, create another layer. We're going to go to our colors and we're going to use this shadow color now, but we're going to turn the size of that to around 2%, but have 100% opacity. And we're just going to, along this edge, use it to create a sharper, stronger shadow compared to anything else. Remember, the sun's coming from up here, so anything on this side of it is going to get a really nice pronounced shadow. Now, it's not a high feature, it's not a tall feature, so it's not going to get a stretched out shadow, it's going to be a thin shadow. So it's mainly this edge, and it's going to be mainly part of this edge too, unless it's stepped back slightly from the edge of the water. So this is going to be part of the tallest section because it is the leading edge, therefore the shadow it creates is going to be the most dramatic as well. The next thing we're going to do along this edge is on the top, I'm going to create another layer. I'm going to go back to my colours. I'm going to use the darker sand colour. It's really appropriate because the foam is going to have bubbles, it's going to have little circles in it where you have a break in that foam, and it's just going to create little circles like this. So I'm going to do a series of different sizes of points of collections of bigger circles. Keep it kind of random. Keep it, I would say, slightly forwards of that edge, but sometimes it will go closer back as well. So just keep it a little bit random. But there'll be some areas perhaps where you don't need to add too much of it at all. So again, it's on 2% size and about 80% opacity. So I'm just using it to create some small circles. If I didn't say already, we're still on the medium brush. If you want to create some slightly subtle effects, you can turn the opacity down as well. Create a series of smaller dots. And this is something you can do anywhere where you've got this foam. So likewise, you could go back to your colours, you could find your dark rich colour, and if you wanted to add some of this effect over here, then you can do some of that over here as well. But I'm going to really focus my energy on this front section. So I'm still doing it with the 2% size, and I have reduced it to 40% opacity. I can go over it a couple of times if I really want to exaggerate a bubble. I could also, if it's really big, use the grey. Perhaps I can almost add a shadow in there as well if I want to really exaggerate it. Combination between the sand colour and the grey colour. If you ever feel like you've done too much, you can always go with the eraser and just remove some of that, because it is just the top element. So if you want to subdue it, have a bit less, then you can always just erase that element back onto your brushes to re-add them if you need to. Again, as I was saying, there is perhaps a difference between where the water is and where the foam is. So you could actually use the grey perhaps just subtly. So I would turn that down really low on the opacity to maybe about 10%. And if you just wanted to create a slighter darker edge with the grey, just to give it a firmer edge that isn't necessarily foam, but it's just enough water to create a slight sense of a darker edge, then you can do that. But it's not going to have as much of a shadow, say, as the foam. Again, don't forget you can create these bubbles within the foam too, further into the water area. Just going to go back a few layers. There was a layer where I was using the different colours to add texture to the background, and you can see with or without it, it still creates the overall effect, but I think just with that extra little bit of noise, perhaps it just looks a bit more turbulent. So I'm just going to go back in and add some more of that. So I'm going to use the grey colour again, low brush size, let's just click out of that, low brush size at 2%, and maybe about 20% opacity, still on the medium brush. And I'm just using this grey just to create some slight disruption to the flatness. Now I'm pressing on really lightly actually. And again, I can alternate with the colours, go to my brightest colour, add more of it where I feel it's necessary. The only thing on perhaps the top layer that you might want to do is with something like the grey is just suggest here and there that there might even be ripples themselves that create shadows. So just be mindful of where you're doing them. And they will go underneath the froth and then just maybe disappear like this. And you may have a couple more here as well. Something like that. Again, just some points of interest perhaps on the sand. Now that we've done most of that, we can just create some more dips, some extra noise in the sand. If you feel it's necessary, you don't need to do that. Sometimes you will get perfectly flat sand, sometimes you'll get pebbles, little indentations, just points of interest, just to break it up, make it look a little less boring. Okay, I'm going to leave that tutorial there at this point. If you've enjoyed following along, then do make sure to press the bell notification button to be notified of future tutorials. If you've really enjoyed it, press that like button. It super helps out the channel. It's really appreciated. Check out all the links in my video description, including my new website and my Patreon, things like that. And otherwise, I hope to catch you back here soon. See you later.